It's hard to be a reader in 2024. Before getting into a good book, you have to somehow ignore your inbox, avoid doom scrolling, break free from the algorithm, and then just when you're getting into it, there's an alert that pulls you back out. That's why reading technology company Soul designed the Soul Reader, a wearable e-reader that helps you shut out the world and get back to reading. You put on the Soul Reader like a pair of glasses. Just slip it on, lay back, and see the pages of a book right there in front of you on an e-ink screen. Think of it as noise canceling for your eyes. No distractions, just words. Check out the Soul Reader at soulreader.com, solreader.com, to start reading without distraction. And if you use the code COVERS15 at checkout, you'll receive 15% off your purchase of Soul Reader Limited Edition. Today's episode is also brought to you by award-winning author Melanie Chang's newest novel, The Burrow. Following the members of the Lee family as they adopt a rabbit in the wake of loss and grief, the novel follows the family as they navigate hope and tragedy, bringing together 4 distinct perspectives and one wide-eyed rabbit. The Burrow reveals the enormity of loss, long-buried family secrets, and how we learn to survive in a newfound world. Rajia Hasib declares, "The Burrow's restrained prose and heartbreaking honesty capture the paradox of living with trauma." And in the words of Helen Garner, the novel provides a calm, sweet, desolated wisdom. The Burrow is out now from Tin House. One of the great conversations of my time as an interviewer was talking to Dionne Brand in 2022 about her career-spanning new and selected poetry nomenclature. Looking back and then forward across 40 years of her life as a poet. So it's with no small amount of anticipation and excitement to have Dionne Brand back again, this time to discuss her latest work of nonfiction, to discuss this time the fraught power of narrative, of story. This latest book also, within it, looks back across her life as a reader. Salvage has been described as a personal history of how a reader is made and unmade. But it isn't only or simply an exploration of how a life can be animated by books, but also of how a life can be destroyed by them. And it isn't only a book about the making and unmaking of a reader, but of the making and unmaking of a self in relation to what one reads and how one reads. How we author a self in relation to the words of others, knowingly or more often quite unknowingly. It isn't often that I have conversations from this lens of reading, even though I think every conversation in a sense is an exercise in close reading, hopefully done slow enough that it feels as if we're doing this close reading together. In fact, the past episode that most leaps out in relation to today's is my conversation with Elaine Castillo about her book, How to Read Now, a conversation and a book in a completely different register than today's, but which deeply shares certain animating questions with regards to encountering texts or re-encountering them, in discovering the self within them or the self dismissed or deformed within them. Both books, I think, model efforts to decolonize the mind, to salvage something from the wreck that is the book put before us, but also the wreck that is us before the book. Before we begin, as we head into the holiday season, I wanted to mention a couple things about the show. For one, Patreon has, for the first time, allowed people to gift memberships to other people, something you might consider for a literary loved one. As of now, this only applies to reward tiers that don't have a finite number of openings, which eliminates quite a few of mine. But it does include the entry level of support, which includes things that every supporter gets, the abundant resources that come with each episode of what I discovered while preparing for it, what we referenced during the conversation, and places to go once you're done listening, and also an invitation to join our collective brainstorm, shaping who comes on the show in the future. And another tier that you can gift is access to the bonus audio archive, which includes Dionne Brand's reading of Kinesia Lubrin and Christina Sharp, Danez Smith's 30-minute incredible reading of 6 poems, each one followed by a writing prompt that they created specifically for us, Nikki Finney's reading from Lorraine Hansberry's diaries, Miriam Chauncey's close pedagogical reading of Jamaica Kincaid, and much more. If you're interested in gifting a membership, you can check that out at patreon.com/betweenthecovers/gift. But more generally, if you aren't yet part of the Between the Covers community and yet value these conversations, there are a lot of other things one can choose from too. From the Tin House Early Reader subscription, receiving 12 books over the course of a year, months before they're available to the general public, to the 100th anniversary new critical edition of Jean Toomer's Cane, which comes with an oracular deck of prompts, gestures, images, questions, and calls to respond, created by many of today's great Black writers, artists, and thinkers, from Alexis Pauline Gumbs to M. Norbesi Phillip, to past Between the Covers guests, Kinesia Lubrin, Christina Sharp, Douglas Kearney, Gabrielle Seville, John Keane, and many others. To find out about all of these things, not just the few things you can gift to others, but the many things that you can gift to yourself, you can check it all out at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And now for today's episode with none other than Dionne Brand. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is poet, novelist, essayist, editor, and teacher Dionne Brand. Moving from Trinidad to Canada in the 1970s, Brand is one of Canada's most renowned writers, a writer whom Adrienne Rich described as, quote, a cultural critic of uncompromising courage, an artist in language and ideas, and an intellectual conscience for her country, and of whom Kamau Brathwaite called our first major exile female poet. A writer with 6 honorary doctorates, who was invested as a member of the Order of Canada in 2017, who was Poet Laureate of Toronto from 2009 to 2012, and who has won too many awards to name, from the OCM Bocas Fiction Prize for Caribbean Literature to the Governor General's Award for Poetry. With Dionne's first appearance on the show in 2022, we looked across her writing life specifically as a poet, timed with the release of her landmark book, Nomenclature, New and Collected Poems, which brought together new material alongside 8 volumes of her poetry from 1982 to 2010. Past Between the Covers guest John Keane said of Nomenclature, Dionne Brand is without question one of the major living poets in the English language. While her individual collections speak for themselves in terms of their excellence and aesthetic and cultural significance, Nomenclature offers readers the fullest gathering of them and provides a survey of her development and trajectory as a poet. Featuring Christina Sharp's superb critical introduction, this authoritative volume is an invaluable and important text for her fans, poetry readers, literary scholars, and those working in Canadian, Caribbean, Black, American, women's, and gender and cultural studies. Any reader will benefit from having a copy in their hands. Since we talked 2 years ago, Brand's most iconic book of nonfiction, A Map to the Door of No Return, Notes to Belonging, originally published in 2001, received its first American edition, published just days ago, in fact, with a new preface by Brand and an afterword by Saidiya Hartman. And nonfiction is the occasion of our talking again today. The release of her new book that blends literary criticism and autobiography called Salvage, Readings from the Wreck, a nonfiction book that largely looks at fiction and which serves as the doorway through which we'll explore Brand's relation to narrative and story today. Saidiya Hartman, in her Bomb magazine interview of Brand, suggests the work of Salvage is not to educate us about the coloniality of the English canon, but to think critically about the novel and narrative as the affective implements of empire, that the toxicity of these foundational texts resides in the values and ideals, in the cultivation and transmission of taste. She suggests that one could look at Salvage as a text that Brand has written across 24 books, that the meta character of Brand's work always reflects the conditions of writing, the materiality and historicity of writing, the predisposition towards certain kinds of narratives and genres, that in both her poetry and prose, we never forget the literary as a mode of production or the aesthetic as a regime of power. In Hartman's introduction to Salvage in that interview, she says the following, which can serve as our introduction to today's conversation. Quote, "For Brand, Black poesis as social practice and creative invention has unfolded as a centuries-long refusal of the given and a ceaseless practice of transfiguration. The possibilities of language are inseparable from the imperative to decompose the narrative of non-being. Such concerns have guided her long-standing inquiry in poetics and fiction. Her work has endeavored to retrieve Black life from the register of pathology by restoring the synesthetic space of our living, the fullness of the sensorium. The task of the writer, simply put, is to find an exit from the collapsed world of empire and the coloniality of form. Through her employment of verbless grammars and nomenclatures, inventories and forensics, Brand transforms language into an open assembly that yields the possibility of conceiving existence anew." Welcome back to Between the Covers, Dionne Brand.
Thank you, David, and thank you for that extensive and wonderful introduction. Thank you. Yeah.
So near the end of the opening section of Salvage, a section called To Recover Belongings from a Wreck, you talk about a life animated by books, which yours has been, but also of a life destroyed by books. You say, quote, "A life animated by books is something that everyone may understand, but a life destroyed by books is the more complex, contradictory, mysterious proposition. The wreck is, of course, possibly a life." So thinking of this and thinking of your quoting of the Marxist writer and scholar C.L.R. James, who said, "Thackeray, not Marx, bears the heaviest responsibility for me," with you then placing yourself in a similar way, you being formed, yes, by C.L.R. James, but also having grown up in the so-called post-colonial world of Trinidad and later Canada, being perhaps simultaneously formed and wrecked by the colonial canon you were taught from an early age. So talk to us about the dual power of books in relation to life, to animate and destroy it. In its broadest strokes, introduce us to the project of Salvage, what you mean by the wreck, a wreck from which we might dive into rescue or to salvage ourselves, perhaps, whether that wreck is ourselves as a result of certain books, or whether the wreck is the books that we engage with.
Yes, all of the above, in a great sense. Suppose I wanted to think through how one is made. And if one is made, then one is also unmade. There's something that's unmade. There's the unmaking of something. And I wanted to think it through the books I'd read or been made to read, their function as educative, their function as instructive and inaugurative, right? If I can say that, if I can make that word up. So I examine the ways in which those 17th, 18th, 19th century texts inaugurated some kinds of peoples, all kinds of peoples, entrance into the communal or the social. And who were those people? There were people such as me who were born into a certain history, the history of what's called the West, right, or the history of what's called the New World, and how texts functioned. That all the affective tools of those texts were put into service, and those two things, seem quite different, service and affect, but they collided in the making of a certain kind of subject. But of course, at the same time that one apprehends that subject, one apprehends the subject being unmade also, or the subject being resisted, the subject against whom those texts position themselves. And the subject whom those texts position themselves against was, of course, the Black subject in the main. Of course, also the indigenous subject. Yeah? And looking at the ways in which those subjects were deployed in those texts, situated the reader. And if the reader were someone like me, then that someone apprehended both its destruction and its construction. So the wreck is both the subject and the library, but something's being made there. And something's being made in the contradiction. And I'm interested in that contradiction, which is also refutation. It's a very, very, very complex space. Then I wanted to talk about what is salvaged, what is rescued from it, given all of what is known. Yeah.
In one of your launch events for this book in Canada, you were asked what it's like to return to these books again. Books you had been taught when you were younger, whether Vanity Fair or Mansfield Park or Robinson Crusoe. And you responded that you didn't see it as a return, that you, and I'm guessing presumably all of us, have been living all along within the proscriptive ways of living that these books have imagined for us, that they provide the scripts for what is beauty, what is virtue, and many other things. And one of the things that comes up on the show a lot is the question, what do words do? What does art do? What is it for? But when I think of story in particular, with narrative, I'm actually both astounded and a bit terrified at just how powerful narrative and story are, how quickly they can enlist us in a given script or a given allegiance. And I'll just make up a sentence. You've made up sentences before in this regard, and I'll make one up, but something like, Jane had forgotten her umbrella. She was late again for work, and the rain-soaked socks were making her toes terribly cold. Just that line, and we're immediately in allegiance with this person, regardless of who she is or who she is in relation to us as the reader. We don't even know her yet. This power of story is something that in your second read of these works, you were working to decouple from in book after book. In Vanity Fair, with your second encounter, you're surprised to encounter a mixed race woman, Mrs. Schwartz, in the first pages, and a servant named Sambo. In Mansfield Park, in a scene about whether they can buy a new horse. You discover in your re-encounter with the text references to their troubles in Antigua, that they have to resolve the disturbances on their plantations there before they can possibly buy this horse. Of course, they're referring, however glancingly, to the people that they've enslaved. These moments were not in your memory from first reading either of these books, and I think this is by design, but they leap out now. It's as if some coercive element of storytelling itself kept even you, a reader of the African diaspora, in allegiance with slaveholding white characters when you were a young reader. It reminds me a little of Fanon when he's talking about being in the movie theater in Martinique and watching people responding to the hero, regardless of who the hero is in relation to themselves. But now you find yourself, or your allegiance is working against the text. So I was hoping you could talk to us about, if not a return to these texts, this revisioning of these texts, this seeing them anew in the second reading of them.
I tell you what, even in the first reading of the text, there is discomfort about the text. But that discomfort is filmed, if you will. There's a scrim presented over the discomfort because of the social world, right? And so there's a prescription to read the text as if expected to identify with the main subjects of the text, right? So that discomfort, I think, for a Black reader is early. It's like a kind of a doubt. One reads that even as a child with a doubt, because there is a failure of the text to completely obscure the social or obscure the politics that one is living. So there is the slight doubt about it, but one is dragooned into, the association, if you will, and that the beginning of a sort of bitter association is early, if not articulated, if not fully articulated, in these with these texts. So my stance in Salvage is one where autobiography is not genre, but conceit. That is, the speaker of the text uses the form of a kind of progression of the character speaking the text in order to kind of illuminate the difficulties that the reader, past and present and future, encounters with those encounters with the text. Mm. So the kind of voluptuousness of those texts, right? The voluptuousness of Jane Eyre, for example, or the voluptuousness of Mansfield Park. The text calls the reader into the conspiracy.
It's a good word.
Of the text, right? Basically into the conspiracy of coloniality, right?
Yeah.
The making of its voluptuousness is never quite present, or is present as right, as correct, but is never quite obscured either. Right? The texts present a correctness of the world. This is the construct of the world. And this is a construct that you might enter, engage in. It might come to reflect your own location too, if you are willing to take part in this conspiracy.
I think it's important to stay with this voluptuousness for a moment. The way you've described these canonical texts working as scripts for living, it seems important to stay with the notion of these texts or scripts as the wreck themselves. It's an inversion of how people typically view the canon, where instead of it being innocently this great celestial pantheon of excellence, it's also being a method from which subjugation, dehumanization, and theft is justified. You say if conquest, slavery, and colonization of lands and people are the main aim, mythologizing and control of the imagination are the equally important conduit to this end. There were at least two ways to me that felt key to understanding what you're doing in this regard. The first involves a quote you share of the Kenyan literature professor and post-colonial scholar Simon Gikandi, who says, "The aesthetic can never be sutured against or cauterized from the quote-unquote colonial event." And you explicitly take this thought of his a step further. You propose that the colonial event is the aesthetic. What is pleasing, what is beautiful in the text isn't inseparably sutured to the violence, but is itself the violence. And you talk about how codes of moral rectitude, virtue, and fair play were presented to the colonies as particularly British and ultimately unachievable by the colonized. But even though a book like Vanity Fair takes place during British slavery, slavery is never mentioned in the text, but virtue, modesty, goodness, religion, and God are. So we witness a society proceeding as if these things are in fact divisible from slavery. I feel like it's important to stay here because, especially for readers who are being addressed, who are used to being more comfortably in the universal, being addressed and can presume their presence in it, might have a harder time understanding or unpacking this distinction between both Gikandi's notion, but also you're taking it further, why this collapsing of the virtuous and the monstrous into not only an indivisible pair, but one and the same thing is an important project.
Yeah, I think there is the tendency to separate those two things, the violence that is trembling in the text. There's violence in the text, and something called beauty that's sort of cordoned off from, but that one is supposed to look at. But these two things in those texts are the same thing, not just underwritten by, but the admiration we must feel for the characters that are kind of performing in the text can't be divided. And what we consume is all of it. Their abilities to produce this. There is something that is not only adjacent to, but is the matter of power that's being consumed by the reader, and the reader is being called into that that consumption also, right? So there is the scrim or the veil of something called beauty, which I think we now have to examine quite deeply. We have to examine that deeply. What is it that we truly mean by that? But all the violence is collapsed into class, into race, into power, and all of that is being consumed at the same time. And there is the frisson of the violence, of the ability to do anything, the power to do anything, not the ability, but the power to do anything. And that is the frisson. That is what is desirable in those texts. And that is what we admire the characters for performing, right? Not thinned out to something called charm, right? Or thinned up to something called rectitude, but the power to deploy violence, to deploy and employ, to inhabit violence, the power over their conditions, in a will, is what is also being, is what is also what we are experiencing in that way that we experience the success of these characters. You know, their loveliness is informed by this power to to deploy this violence also.
Yeah.
Right. That's what's beautiful about them.
Yeah.
Right. There's something about that, you know. Yeah. But
Well,
take me back into the question, if you will. And
Yeah, well, I have a second query about the canon as a rec. It may be a stretch, so push back if this feels like it is one. But
okay,
as part of Sadia Hartman's interview of you and Baum, she establishes three factors that she sees as formative influences that the two of you share as writers and thinkers. The Grenada Revolution is one, something that you and I talked about when you were on the show to talk about nomenclature. You're living in Grenada before the US invasion and participating in the revolutionary government. The second was post-colonial theory, which we see explicitly throughout Salvage, from Chikandi to Spivak to Said. And the third is the revolutionary thinker from Guinea-Bissau, Amilcar Cabral, whose influence she calls the intertext in your work. And I don't think he's explicitly named in Salvage, so I wanted to give some thought on how he might be animating your work here. And of course, once I share my theory, I'd love to hear how he is or isn't part of this project. But we could take his definition of imperialism, which he characterizes as the, quote, worldwide expression of the search for profits and the ever-increasing accumulation of surplus value, as one way to frame your engagement with these canonical books, which largely celebrate life, I think, that inhabits the bubble of that surplus value, the loveliness and voluptuousness you're describing. But I was thinking of something else. Cabral talks about how colonizers believed that they were bringing colonized people into history, that before colonization, they were in a cyclical, self-producing system that was static and ahistorical. And now, thanks to the colonizer, placed in history, they were dynamic. They had a dynamism that they had before lacked. And Cabral argues, obviously, the opposite, that the colonizer fossilized the colonized, fixed them in a static way, denied them a relationship to their own histories, preserved them in the colonizer's imaginary as one thing. I think of this because as you navigate various texts in the book, you note how many of the Black characters are fixed, determined, flat, and not uncommonly comic caricatures, certainly always caricatures. Nevertheless, contrary to many who say Black life has been excluded from these texts, you talk about how Black life still animates them. In a recent event you did for the early Caribbean Society, you say Blackness isn't absent in these texts, it is their meter. They are transfused with colonialism. They make the pages thick. I wondered if this inversion Cabral makes regarding the colonized in history in relation to stasis and dynamism and your oppositional reading of these texts, if this feels like a real or maybe a forced comparison I'm making. But either way, if you had any thoughts about Cabral as an intertext in your work in the ways that Sadia Hartman seems to suggest it as one.
more than likely, yes, I think so. I think Cabral was very influential in my thinking in general, and so I think I think that it's true that I use that thinking in analyzing not just these texts, but writing itself and what the project might be, given those things. I think of these 17th, 18th, 19th century writers as proselytizers for their time and class and the colonial project. And I think over the course of the last few hundred years, and when these texts now become canonical, that aspect of their work is forgotten. But that they saw themselves as standard bearers for British colonialism. And it's in that project of British colonialism, in the ideological project of colonialism, that they created these texts, these main characters and these locations for Blackness in their texts. And so they're the kind of propaganda making machine of that era, of that epoch, in order to forward that colonial project, the economies of that colonial project. They saw themselves as rightly and richly doing so by creating these tech, these adventures, if you will. And so they've been kind of handed down as without form to the present, and they're incredibly influential on the present and on present forms of writing and fiction making. What you wish for a character, the arc of a character, and all those things. But I don't think that they didn't see themselves as part of the project. They didn't see their art as so different from their government, whichever place they landed, whichever politics or whichever political party they represented or were part of, or whichever arguments they were part of in that epoch, they didn't see themselves as different from that in the ways that we've compartmentalized that project in the present. And so I'm trying to think about the unsaid even in our own epoch in writing and in writing shape and in writing form.
Well, before we look at how these elements that we've discussed so far manifest within a given text, I wanted to discuss an exception to this phenomenon, or what seems like one but really isn't one, which is the elevated, exceptional Black figure who gets to contain many of the virtues his people are otherwise excluded from. What you call the half human until educated status of the enslaved, where any emancipation that does occur does nothing to undercut the definition of the savage. And you look at the exceptional figure in various ways, but perhaps most at length with the 17th century novel by Aphra Behn, Orinoco, whose full title is Orinoco or the Royal Slave, A True History, where Orinoco, an enslaved prince of African royalty, is praised for having European features and the countenanced sweetness and softness of Europeans. And you quote Zakiya Iman Jackson, who said, "Black people are not so much dehumanized as non-humans or cast as liminal humans, nor are Black people framed as animal-like or machine-like, but are cast as sub, supra, and human simultaneously, and in a manner that puts being in peril, constructing Black humanity as the privation and exorbitance of form." And you also use a phrase, romantic racialisms, that you say carries forward in literature from the time of Orinoco onward to today. All that said, I suspect most people are probably unfamiliar with this book today, even though Aphra Behn is often put forth as the first professional woman writer, one that Virginia Woolf said of, "All women together ought to let flowers fall upon the tomb of Aphra Behn, for it was she who earned them the right to speak their minds." So I was hoping you could talk a little bit more both about the exceptional Black figure and the racial romantic imaginary, but hopefully also through the lens of this, of orienting us to this book in particular and your thoughts about this book in particular.
Yeah. I think it's still taught in 17th century.
Yeah.
Well, in universities in
Yes.
17th century lit, 18th century lit, British literature, and so on. I did a talk using this part of the book, and a number of professors came up to me and said, "Oh my God!" but this figure that Aphra Behn represents in Orinoco, the royal slave. Aphra Behn, by the way, went to Suriname prior to writing this book. And so Aphra Behn had a practical experience of slavery and, returned to England, wrote this book based in a sense on her conception of what was going on in that colony, Dutch colony at the time, and there was a fight between the Dutch and the British for Suriname, and decided to make this sort of idol of that period and those people. So she was witness to slavery, and then proposed this figure, Orinoco. In order to make this figure likable or charming to British readers at the time, he had to be kind of like white or like white British, but unlike enough to plumb the kind of dangerous side of a male figure who is black, so one can work in desire in a different kind of way with that figure, unknown, desirous, dangerous, and then to present that figure suitably enough to a white audience. Her descriptions of him are most unlike, and continually, repeatedly describing him as not really that kind of black as those others who are actually savages, but could much be to the liking of British whites. But for his color, he is white. Mm. Yeah. Not only is he white, he's a prince from Africa, and he was himself a slave trader, but was wrongly taken into slavery himself. But one could just see by his royal, mien and visage, how above those other people, who we are enslaving are, etc. Right? So it's a romance with this added kind of soupçon of danger and the forbidden, etc. Mm. And naturally, he always saves the white people in the book. Naturally, he's even more noble than the white people in the book, but for that, he will die also. I mean, it's just incredible. But I kind of trace the making of that character, if you will, the making of that kind of black man in those texts, and his continued representation in white texts along the way, and the uses that figure is put to, the desires that whiteness can have for that character, who is, both dangerous and savior-like, and how that character works in the ascription of those kinds of characteristics to modern day figures, the lasting of that particular figure through literature, through English literature, but also just through life. That figure who is the good black, who isn't like the other black people, who is more noble and who can be trusted. But that figure always remains up in the air also, because that figure can fall from grace, right? In fact, Orinoco, the prince, is actually murdered in the end. He cannot possibly survive whiteness. Yeah.
You draw a line from the exceptionalized Orinoco all the way to modern figures like Tiger Woods and Obama. And when I think of Obama and now Kamala, I think of a phrase Saidiya Hartman used in your conversation, the nightmare of inclusion, where about your new book, she says, the forensics, the analysis, and excavation undertaken is not about the project of inclusion, which desires to step into the same regime of the subject and achieve recognition and visibility in identical terms. Bridgerton is an easy example. If there's an adjustment or shift in this colonial regime of representation, it is in the expanded hues of its cast, but all that it promises is the endless reproduction of the same. It's the nightmare of inclusion. Yes, Black and brown actors can extend and reanimate the imperial text, can resurrect aristocrats and slaveholders, endowing them with a new life. This is happening in the political field too. And when I think of the political field and this notion of an endless reproduction of the same, I also think of when I was talking to Ngugi wa Thiong'o for the show. He talked about the irony of himself being imprisoned in Kenya for writing anti-colonial texts that critique the government. but being imprisoned by a government with leaders who had themselves fought the British, but who still now gave their speeches in English, a language that less than 10% of the population spoke, and how kids were being punished and shamed in schools for speaking their mother tongues. And we talked more structurally about how in so many African countries, a small elite of African government administrators are essentially preserving the Eurocentric colonial extractive relationship that predated independence, that the hue of skin had changed of the functionaries, but not the function. After Saidiya Hartman established the three ways, the two of you were forged from shared influences. After talking of these shared post-colonial thinkers like Spivak and Said, she says, contrasting the two of you to these post-colonial thinkers, ours is a different moment where in the wake of the post-colonial, the post no longer has critical purchase. We are all too aware that we exist in the stronghold of coloniality. In light of that, presuming you agree with her about that, it seems as important as ever to interrogate politics of representation and the exceptionalizing figure. And I wondered if that sparked any further thoughts for you.
Well, now that you elucidated it that way, I'm thinking about the other figure, like the other world being made. That is, I'm thinking too about how whiteness is made. I get all the permutations that blackness kind of runs through, all kinds of characters that one has to become or situate oneself against whiteness in these ways, all the creations, of personas that must be arranged against the thing. And I'm interested in how whiteness keeps being reconstructed. And in the moment that we're living, it is in a kind of death spiral, but it's sort of taking all of us with it. So when I look at the politics kind of around the world and the rising of fascisms around the world, the various fascist parties being elected in Europe, their strength and their comeback with a vengeance, and the one in the United States and the one here in Canada too. And they're presenting themselves with a kind of new veneer which denies their presence in a way, or makes their presence commonsensical, while they propose a kind of return to slavery, quite frankly, is the end of that, right? Because they re-say or re-speak what the human is again. They take up that argument once again about who is inside and who is outside, who is human and who is not, in their references to people who are fleeing the very projects that they forwarded for the last 100 or so years, the capitalist projects that have been forwarded for the last several hundred years, and their utter fear and therefore violence on those populations that have been enclosed by those projects, those economic projects, whether it's those economic projects forwarded in South America or on the continent of Africa, and people fleeing those very economic projects and being pushed back into the sea. So I'm interested in that new formation. I understand the ways in which Black people have organized themselves against those formations, certainly, and those are a myriad and crazy ways, but it is against something, right?
Yeah.
And then I see this repositioning of the something, and the strong repositioning of the something. That is something that I'm interested in now. If we talk about the moment that we are in now, in examining that and its utter peril. I'm interested in analyzing these processes in these texts and how and what those are and what they generate. And it is for something. It is for analyzing our present. It's for undoing those texts, their influences, and where they have landed us, right? Where they have landed us as educative tools, their influence on the acts of writing themselves, where they have detoured many of us in responding to them, in responding to the processes they describe and the processes they generated. And then now I'm interested in, where work might go, or what is the kind of literary strategy or the literary structure that might upend that project, even as we are stuck in the project.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you engage with a lot of canonical texts, and I thought we could spend a little time with one of them, and then later on with various strategies that have been attempted in reimagining, and then your own predilections around reimagining or imagining. So let's first talk about Defoe's Robinson Crusoe on its own terms.
Must we? Okay.
It's the book I
Okay.
think you spend the most
Yeah.
time with. And you say it's a novel whose structure you can call the structure that haunts all structures, and whose narrative you call the narrative that haunts all narratives. And you don't say this outright, but I suspect you might agree that because of this, even if we haven't read Robinson Crusoe, that in many ways we probably actually have read Robinson Crusoe. So talk to us about why you choose and foreground this text in particular. What are the elements of structure and narrative in this book that continue to reiterate themselves into the known world of today? Why this book?
Because it is replicated so much, not only in novels, but in our period on television shows, on in movies, etc. It's a sort of, it's a podcast, so people won't see my scare quotes, but it's the adventure. Someone goes out into the world, an unknown world, encounter unknown hostiles, either kills them or befriends them, and befriending is a relation of power because that character comes from the known world and the real world, and anything else outside of the real world is unknown and therefore savage and therefore of lower kind of quantity and quality and must be taught something. It's always the educative European moving out into the world to treat the world in some way. And so in major and minor ways that resonates throughout story in North America and in Europe to a degree, right? It's on television in shows like Survivor, and there's that. The expected hostility outside of the immediate, right? Like outside of the immediate is never conviviality. We are never going to see the world and see what we do not know truly, or what might enrich us spiritually. We are going to, with all haste, to produce violence
Mm.
and power. Right? When I think about how that structure, that kind of thinking just is so fundamental to story, it's terrible. You have to undo it in some ways to see it and then to make something of it. Many, many, many writers have made other things, right? Uh, but that's a prevalent one. That's a really, and it's an easy one. One lays one's hand on it so easily, without thinking, eyes closed, eyes shut. And one can just lay that story out. And so many writers, past and also present, have replicated it, find it fascinating, and have underwritten it. And movies too. All those movies going out into all those sci-fi movies going out into space, even. It's the same project, right? It's the same thought. Yeah. What is imagined is that kind of a world. So that's its influence, I think. So I chose that book to work with in that way.
Well, Robinson Crusoe, as you said, influences a lot of things from Lord of the Flies to the reality TV show Survivor. Both Marx and Engels write about this book. Rousseau
Yes.
writes about this book. Jonathan's.
Mathematicians use the book. Math texts used to anyway use the book, and the relation between Crusoe, how Crusoe manages that island
Huh.
economically, and how it's a kind of everyman, right? Yeah.
And Swift's Gulliver's Travels which was written just after it. Some people see it as a rebuttal to it. You primarily look at two adaptations or reconfigurations of Defoe that I wanted to touch on. One is by the Nobel laureate J.M. Coetzee called Foe. It is interesting that while Defoe wrote Friday as an indigenous man, over time he has largely become adapted in various ways as a black man, which is true in Coetzee's book. And you note that Foe was written at the height of resistance to South African apartheid. I haven't read this book, but from what I've read about it, both by you and elsewhere, he adds new elements, but in your mind, the new is very much a repetition of the old. So talk to us about what Foe does to modernize Defoe and how and why you see it not as an evaluation of, but a sort of doubling down on the original text, where you say, when I read Foe, I see there all the thick, curdling histories it disavows, all the sedimented mathematics it ignores, all the sophistry it rehearses, and all the discredited theories it proposes anew. So there's definitely no love lost between you and this book.
No, I, I'm I'm questioning whether one can rewrite something like that anyway, and why one chooses to rewrite something like that. I'm not sure what's redeemable about that project. It introduces a female character in the book as the protagonist. However, the figure hovers over the female character, and the female character wants to tell that tale or to find someone to tell that tale. So if you think, okay, so we introduce a female character into the text, and this is at the height of feminism's arguments also, as well as the end of apartheid. But what's the purpose of it? How the female character changes the text? For me, not really at all. She she's abandoned. She's also shipwrecked on the island and finds Crusoe and finds Friday, and then they are rescued, and Friday runs away. Friday runs away, but she makes the ship's captain find Friday and bring him on board, right?
Mm.
Uh, and Friday is without speech. You have the kind of figure of blackness without speech, without voice, supposedly. And that Friday is a kind of unexplained and unexplainable figure. And yes, that is nothing new in the realm of literature and also in the social and political world of our time, right? So Friday doesn't come into speech, if that is important. I mean, it's of no consequence to Friday. Friday is a mere object being moved around the text, just like he was an object moved around the text in the original. And I don't find any of the sort of vaunted philosophical arguments of the text interesting or necessary. The text is also taking place in a time where that is the text arrives to us in a deeply important political time in South Africa, right? Where Okonto Wesizwe has won that, right? And there are speaking subjects out of that long and devastating history. You know, there are Black South African figures coming into power with their own long stories, with the dreadful power of the apartheid state, its imprisonments, its murders, its killings, unattended. Yeah. So if there is a correlation of some kind with the appearance of the text and the moment of the ending of apartheid, it's not available to me. Let's put it that way, right?
Yeah.
Not in reality, not in the real life of yeah.
No, I was curious about Coetzee's relationship to Defoe, whether this book was a passing interest or whether there was something more longstanding for him. Looking around, I was surprised at how central it is for him, with Defoe being central to Coetzee's Nobel acceptance speech.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
it's a speech titled "He and His Man," which you'd likely think would be a reference to Crusoe and Friday, but instead it's a meditation on Crusoe and Defoe, given that Defoe writes Crusoe as if Crusoe had written the book himself. So the speech is about decoys and parrots, about Crusoe and Defoe as a way to look at Coetzee and Defoe. And Friday is barely a footnote, referred to in passing as Crusoe's quote unquote serving man. And it reminds me of what you said about Thackeray, that he's a writer interested in the mores of British aristocracy, not colonial exploitation. But here you could argue, given the political setting you've just fleshed out for us, that Coetzee is at least as extreme in that regard, or if not more.
Perhaps. I mean, but he has his own concerns. In A Map to the Dawn of No Return, I talk about his novel Disgrace, which is a kind of realist novel, unlike many others, and the main character's location at the end of apartheid, the main character and his daughter, but which I think that novel presented a bleak notion about what might happen after white power was undone in South Africa. The concerns in Foe about Black power, in a sense, if we were to read it that way, if we were to read, Friday's silence in that way, the inability to Friday to make himself known to the white world, right? The white world's misapprehension about Friday. It's also a bleak picture of that relation, but also the same picture of that relation. The same oblique perception of the location of Blackness and whiteness, the same misrepresentations of Blackness in a way. Defoe, at least in some senses, admitted the project of his time, admitted being engaged in a particular location in the project of his time. But to still leave these matters as if they are up in the air, as if Black presence or Black consciousness is still kind of unknown or strange, to leave it still ill-defined as it was in its antecedent is problematic.
You ask rhetorically, what if Coetzee had instead considered the autobiography of an ex-colored man by James Weldon Johnson, or Herman Melville's Benito Cereno instead, in his rendering of Friday? In this gesture toward a potential alternate archive, I want to talk about it in a broader sense later on. But for now, talk to us about either or both of these texts, one by a Black writer, the other by a white one, and why they would come to mind as alternate dynamic influences in portraying Black life on the page.
Well, I think Benito Cereno is a kind of incredible text where there's a ship that appears to be run by a white captain when approached by another ship. And the ship is kind of listing and has some problems. And when approached by another ship and another white captain, what appears on board is that there is a white captain and there are captives Black captives aboard who are going about the work on the ship where the white captain and the white sailors are in control. As the narrative proceeds, there's an uncanniness on board. There's a sense of uncanniness, but the captain of the other ship just assumes, oh well, that's they're doing this or that act of work, etc. We come to find out that when the other captain leaves and goes on to his other ship, the captain of the ship, who appears to be in control, dives into the water and swims to the other ship. And we realize that, in fact, all the people who had been enslaved on board the ship are actually running the ship. Yeah, there's been an uprising on the ship, and they've taken the ship over, and they've made the white captain act as if he is in charge of the ship. And the chief of that rebellion is a man named Babel. And the other ship then captures the ship, realizing that there had been a rebellion on board, and Babel is sentenced to death, right? Without saying a word, not a word in his defense, because it's not necessary. It's not necessary to defend your freedom in a sense, right? Or rebellion against tyranny. I find that a really amazing story appearing at the time that it did, because it said something about Black sovereignty. It said something about the misapprehension that whiteness was under in terms of Black sovereignty and Black people thinking of their freedom foremost. And it objects to abjectness of Black people. And it more represents the time, right? It refuses the idea of abjection at all and the representation of the abject Black in narratives of the period and before. So it represents, in a sense, the true spirit of Blackness in that epoch of slavery, that at every turn, people tried to free themselves, right? The many slave rebellions, the pressure that system was under constantly from Black resistance. So I thought, well, what if we looked at that kind of text for at least a true representation of the moment of those epochs, yeah, and let us start from there, as opposed to the projects that triumphed, like The Adventures or Mansfield Park. But there is another archive, and this book being part of that archive. And what was the other one? What was the other one?
Oh, the autobiography of an ex-colored man.
Just a beautiful arch, subterranean kind of look at the decisions that Black people make, right? And this is a passing man, a man who could pass, and observes through that time the difficulties of being Black with erudition, with a wonderful kind of philosophical exhaustion, and deep observation of those times. And yes, so what if that were your character?
Mm.
What if that is the character you choose? The one who is self-conscious about the conditions of their living. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, before we depart from Crusoe, which I know you would like to do, I think it's important to talk about the other adaptation you spend time with, because
Yeah.
this represents both your meditation on Crusoe and then your meditation on adaptations and missed opportunities around adaptations. Represents the way you engage with these other texts in the book as well. So the other adaptation of Defoe you look at is Crusoe's Footprint by the Creole writer from Martinique, Patrick Chamoiseau, which, according to the publisher's text, has Crusoe reconsider his origins and his humanity, and in doing so creates a powerful meditation on race and history by bringing both Creole history and the slave trade explicitly into Defoe's story, which is previously told in a largely ahistorical way, and doing all of this with a free-form prose with a distinctly Creole cadence. So unlike Coetzee or Defoe or Thackeray, Chamoiseau is bringing colonial exploitation and the slave trade explicitly into the text itself in a foregrounded way. And yet, the project still remains fundamentally doomed in your eyes in certain crucial ways. So I was hoping we could spend a moment with Chamoiseau's project, which is clearly doing things that Coetzee isn't doing in reformulating, but yet brings up some philosophical questions for you fundamentally as a writer and a reader and a worker of the Black imaginary.
Yeah, I love Patrick Chamoiseau. I love his novel Texaco, Solibo Magnificent. So much of his work is so thrilling. And this text is also very agile because we find that Crusoe is not Crusoe. Crusoe is a doggone man who gets a blow to the head and is shipwrecked and finds a jacket with the word Crusoe written in it and takes on this persona. But we don't know that until the end, right? We just meet Crusoe on this island and the reenactments of that other novel take place, but they take place in quite different ways. What happens to Crusoe on that island in wanting to colonize the island, he finds himself in a kind of deep existential thought, deep existential moment for him about his relation to the world, to animals, to plants, to the planet, etc. And so in that way, it's a really interesting meditation because it reorients that Crusoe, that those relations that Crusoe established with, with marking out his plantations on the island, the early Crusoe, and only configuring his life in precisely the same way that he would have configured it were he in London or Brazil, where that Crusoe had traveled to and started a plantation. But he reconfigures his life in these ways and rethinks his life. We find out at the end, close to the end of the novel, that he's actually a doggone man who is in a kind of surreal mental blitz of some kind where he takes on this character. And then a long dissertation or rumination on the human is presented in this work. And my question to the work is, why save that? Is that rumination may take place in every location, in every other iteration, and that one doesn't need that figure to do that in fact. And I understand the conceit of picking up that figure to try to, work that, make that work. But for me, it only reintroduces that figure and signals that that is the figure worth saving.
Well, let me read some of what you say because I really love this section. It's full of a particular verve and pointedness, I think. To echo what you've just said, you say there, why does Chamoiseau need this figure of Crusoe in order to look again? Why rehabilitate this figure at all? Why must his figure be held up as the one through which all of us must think about the ideas and urgencies of our time? And the text as a whole cannot help but be about the rehabilitation of the European in light of colonialism. Its address cannot be anything but a lesson to Europeans, a talking back to, but not talking beyond European feeling. But the part that I really love is where you say, in his notes at the end of his book, Chamoiseau remarks, quote, "It's sad. Defoe's Crusoe was a slave trader." But this reader asks, why is that sad? I am not sad that Crusoe was a slaver. I am sad that I have had to read him as the universal human. And in that spirit, whereas the moment when Crusoe discovers the footprint on the island that suggests he is not alone, For Chamoiseau, it represents the philosophical call to acknowledge the other. But for you, it creates a hope for Crusoe's ultimate demise, that someone will come and dispose of this guy, which we're shortly going to do. But, but, but I think of when Isabella Hamad was recently on the show about her book and speech, Recognizing the Stranger, which is about turning points, both in narratives, but also in her own life since October 7th. And at one point in our conversation, she addresses people who've been shaken from what they thought they knew into a space where they're on a journey, but they haven't quite arrived at a new place yet. And the fear of losing the architecture of our lives, the familiar, however rotten that architecture is, the familiar architecture that is suddenly being removed. And I wonder if our responses to the footprint might, in the most general, roughest sense, be determined by how much of that architecture of empire inside of ourselves upholds our lives versus is crushing them down. You write how that from Camus to Cormac McCarthy, it is the footprint that worries the European novel, the European fear and disaffectation with other people. It's not really a question, but let's spend another beat with Crusoe's footprint and this divergence between you and Chamoiseau in regards to what that signifies.
Yeah, as I say, I don't want to rehabilitate that character. I don't want to rehabilitate that man. It's not my concern at all. That man should actually vanish. And it is not my project to rehabilitate that man. It is my project to be free of it, of him. Right? He's not worth saving. That's a persona that all must abandon in light of what we are living. In making that Crusoe the delusional doggone man, I thought that was another crucial and important bit of thinking. Really, it's how we too are inhabited and delusioned by that project. And so I thought that was an interesting piece of work too. And Chamoiseau's nonfiction text is also an interesting one, Migrant Brothers. I don't know if you know that text.
I don't.
Where he talks about the Mediterranean, the boats in the Mediterranean, the boats coming from the continent in the Mediterranean, and what is required of making relation in the world. So yes, I want to be rid of that structure or that compulsion to kind of redo certain kinds of texts, not only in terms of story, but in terms of arc or progress, because they are so wedded to the economies of colonialism, the economies of racism, that one cannot be rid of them if one merely imprints them. One has to have the project of being rid of them, not imprinting them, not laying on them. What they are palimpsestic of is colonialism, not freedom. So deeply embedded they are in our structures of storytelling that, yeah.
Well, Salvage examines many strategies that have been done to reformulate canonical text, whether Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea in relation to Jane Eyre, or your own rewriting of Camus by giving the Arab figure in The Stranger a name. But even though you put forth some successful examples of canonical reimaginings, like John Keane's story Rivers in relation to Huckleberry Finn, most of these examples that begin with the canon and reformulate it seem unsatisfactory to you, as you've just spoken about. Salvage proposes a different way to go, but before we explore it, I want to first explore some of the parallel rivers that run through the book. One is the pandemic, which you engage with at some length near the beginning, where you say, increasingly we suspect what has entered our lives is something irreparable, something irreversible, something undoable, like wreckage. You say at one point, the pandemic has left the headlines and we are back to normal, or normal quadrupled, which is to say more extraction, more war, the most rapid means of growth of capital, and more designation, eradication of the human beings extraneous and dispensable to the project of normal. Normal, it must be concluded, is nihilism capital, churning up disasters, geological and human, since that is all we are getting back to. I remember, I don't know if this is the same or even compatible or not, but I remember thinking during the height of the pandemic that the amazing, swift, and massive global coordination to shut down commerce, shut down travel, shut down sporting and cultural events, come up quickly with new protocols for moving or not moving through the world, pooling scientific resources transnationally to come up with a vaccine faster than ever, avoiding all the protocols that would slow that down. For me, it spoke to the lie that we couldn't radically change the way we do things in relation to any number of things, whether that's climate change or immigration policy, that it must really be a lack of will, that we are only motivated to do this in really incredible change at a moment's notice by the prospect of this return to normal. And the return to normal is so enticing that we will do the impossible and make the world temporarily utterly unrecognizable only if the promise is on the other side the same thing.
Right.
With no country taking this incredible opportunity to reimagine themselves on the other side of the pandemic.
Yeah.
These are my thoughts, not yours, but
No.
talk to us about the pandemic, what it showed you, and also how it relates to the project of Salvage, why you wanted to have the pandemic be in Salvage.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I totally agree with you on that, that we saw during the pandemic how what we had been told could not be done for decades before, that is to change the world systems, and how rapidly that could be done. What the massive structures put to the true use of like saving people, right? How that could be engineered. So we know this can be done. That was the one thing, the one great lesson about that is that when we're told, oh, this can't be done, this will take this long, it cannot be reversed, all of those things, we see how all those resources were put to doing some particular thing. And I think you're right in the sense of all that happened because of the deep urge to spring back to normal. It also happened because of the deep fear. There was a deep biological fear immediately, the adrenaline that ran through the bodies across the globe, and the powers that be, yeah, to make those kinds of moves. And then we heard birds singing, and we heard, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Everything actually did that, and so we can't unsee that moment. That's possible. But we also saw the inequality across the globe of the distribution of those very things, right? The distribution of the vaccine across the globe, who got it first, who got it last. We understood all of that. So I think the pandemic entered the text because, well, we were in such a moment. I was writing it in that moment too. I was writing the book in that moment. And many of the things in the book were revealed to me also, even more. The pandemic illuminated those things even more in some ways. And it also said, in a sense, hell, I'm going to write this. Basically, like, what are we waiting for here to assign those texts to the heap of history, to dispense with them so that we can get on with another life, as opposed to a repetition of life, a repetition of an old and burdensome life. So it's centered there. And what it did was it also brought all of the world into knowing all of the world. The North could not, as I say in the text, dispel its usual, beneficence, its meager beneficence on the South. It couldn't accuse the South of being like bereft and always bereft, because the North was bereft too. So it layered, it leveled a certain space and a certain framework. Um, yeah.
Well, when you and I and Adania Shibli spoke in New York City last month, we looked at together and interrogated the notion of the human. We looked at humanism. We looked at who democracy is and isn't for, and Adania's question of whether one's allegiance is with citizenship, with one's government, or with literature. In that aura of that, I wanted to ask you about your extended meditation on the pronoun we in relation to the pandemic, but also I think with regards to how we read. I love the missed opportunity that you evoke about the pandemic around a we, where you say, echoing some of what you just said, a broad we in the global north briefly felt the way it is to live in the global south, under siege, under lack, under restraint. The world folded like cloth or like paper into the uncomfortable recognition of the we, of its geological whole. We suddenly felt the earth as if our feet were on the same shaky surface. The earth compressed its air and time together and briefly made all distinctions superfluous. We went from world to earth to planet, and we realized the planet is indifferent to us. But perhaps the return to this nihilistic normal is related to what you say about reading, the ways the white we, innocently and casually summoned, is a metonym for every we, that it is, as you say, an administrative category, a gathering place of colonial imperialist desires. Or as Christina Sharp says, as one reads, one always encounters that curious we, that we constituted with no reference to one's own being, a we made impossible by me. It feels like the we is a particularly unstable construction, both with insistence and yet also somehow at the same time in flux. One sentence in this book captures the potential of both, I think, where you say, we binds the affective, the convivial sense of being in the world with other people, to relations of ruling. So talk to us more about this twinning of collectivity in the world and the we in the world of writing, which might seduce us with that promise, but yet might be doing its opposite.
Yeah. So, I really wanted to you examine this figure, we. And as I say, that we is often co-opted into the stato, the nation, the government, when its qualities are about the convivial, the communal, the social. Its qualities are kind of about the recognition of our fragility on the planet, etc. Yeah. But it is it is drawn into by states, by certain kinds of economies, by certain sets of billionaires with projects of their own, which they then, dispense to us as projects that we have. Um, Certain kinds of economies that present themselves as inevitable. Capital presents itself as inevitable and as the always here thing, but not as itself on shaky ground. Yeah. And it has much reason to present itself as common, because it has taken over the social space and the public space in ways that we don't even actually examine anymore. We simply think that is the nature of we use that expression. That's the nature of the world, right? But what this term is using, in a sense, are all the other, much more potent, very, very potent materials of our needs our same needs, the need to breathe, the need to eat, the need to rest, the need to, play, etc. Right? And so it has collected that description as a description of itself. So we're living it in this double way, but capital and these economies of capital continually, pull that into service, pull that we into service, so that one cannot anymore see the separation. But those of us who exist at a particular cardinal point in capital understand that we is divisible always, the always possibility of being expelled from the we, right? Called and expelled at the same time into the we.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thinking about Christina's we made impossible by me, and also an often quoted line from A Map to the Door of No Return. One enters a room and history follows. One enters a room and history precedes. History is already seated in the chair in the empty room when one arrives. I was hoping you would talk to us about you in this book, namely when you say the autobiographical aspect of the book is artifice. How are you, or how is and isn't your I in Salvage?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. Two things. In Salvage, I'm always fleeing the I in some ways, yeah, or using the I as I use the I in my poetry, which is the I of the particular moment, the I of the particular time. Yes, and one. So now I'm going to one, the passive. One contends.
I love that.
one one contends with that history all the time. And I guess I, the writer, try to be what I call clinically aware of that history, clinically aware of my moving it like one moves one, like a, girasol, like one moves one's head around the sun or something, to be constantly aware of the permutations of that history, the facts of it, and its emanations, like how it moves, how it presents in the world, right? And under capital, its continuous permutations, the angles from which one sees it or how one sees it. And as I'm saying that, I'm reminded of Torkwase Dyson's hypershapes, the visual artist Torkwase Dyson's hypershapes, which I talk about in the text too, which are these shapes that evoke thousands of shapes, which think about the angle from which those in the hold saw the world, right? And what might be put together, the alacrity of that, yeah, the sensibility that produced, that angle, whichever angle it might have been in the hold, to see the world coming in a way. So I'm trying my best to orient and reorient myself to the positionings of colonial practices as they too evolve, of imperialist practices as they too evolve and shift shape. And I think as a writer, I'm trying to attend to that and catch the movement all the time in an effort to circumvent it, you know? Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up Torkwase Dyson and the hypershapes, because I feel like before we talk about your proposal of how to move forward, having left the wreck of the canon, the other parallel stream through the book from its opening pages is your engagement with visual art. One might think, hearing that maybe you're contrasting visual art to the writing world, that perhaps it is a less colonized space, but really you're interrogating the frame of these works too, putting forth examples like you do with writing that felt caught in coloniality, like Kehinde Wiley's paintings, which recreate art from older periods but replacing white bodies with black ones, where you say, in my view, such portraits create no disruption in the narratives of the paintings. The corpus of the triumphalist white heroic painting overwhelms and seduces the renewed portraits and reverberates in European painting itself, not as parody, but as envy and admiration, as desire. But like with writing, you also put forth paintings that activate your imagination or liberate your imagination, whether Remedio Varo's exploration of the sources of the Orinoco River, or as you've mentioned today, Torquasi Dyson's hypershapes. But I'd love to hear you talk in particular about the photo of you as a child with your sisters to be sent to England to your mother and aunt who are away there. And thinking of autobiography and your fleeing of the eye, you say you don't recognize yourself in the photo, and or that you recognize yourself as authored and altered and composed for the photograph and the photographer, Mr. Wong. But you also say that perhaps your life, your whole writing life emanates from this photo. So let's center this artifact of visual art among the many engagements with visual art in the book.
Yeah, it's a photograph, like so many photographs that left the Caribbean or that left the South to go north,
Mm-hmm.
right? And in that sense, it's a common trope of those from the other world sending notes to the metropoles. Those notes were letters, sometimes themselves, actual letters, but they were also these photographs. And there was a succeeding set of photographs of those who had arrived at the metropoles, sending photographs back, back as it seemed in time and place. Yeah? And I was interested in that as an artifact, or those as artifacts, those photographs. And this particular photograph is made to do that work. And I was thinking of what is the work that the photograph is doing. The photograph would not have existed in any other context but to produce this exchange, right? Or to be part of this exchange. Because the people taking the photograph or around the production of the photograph don't have the means to take the photograph themselves. So, one has to go to the photographer's studio, be set up in a particular way, and then the photograph is transported. So it's not a photograph taken for, oh, this is the family portrait, but in effect, it is the family portrait. But what lies inside of the portrait are all of these relations of coloniality, all of these relations with the metropole, and the thing that is, and the things that are to be produced from the transportation of the photograph. So I wanted to think about the photograph in that way. And this is why I use the conceit of the autobiography to think with the photograph. But I also use autobiography in the sense that Gramsci defines autobiography as this smallest unit of, of life that extrapolates through the social and the political, right? So not a bourgeois notion of the autobiography, the grand, the grand story being produced to, elucidate the life of the grand person or even the interesting person. It's not singular in that sort of way, but common in a way. So this photograph of myself with my siblings was always a disturbing photograph for me. And maybe that disturbance was contained. Maybe that lack of recognizability was contained in that very process. So it morphed from a person not recognizing themselves to a person not recognizing themselves because they are produced. Um, that is a representation of the entire process in some ways. All the girls in the photograph, and there are four of them, are in the middle of being made themselves. Everybody is being made. Everything is up. Yeah. Even though they are cautioned to present a figure for the metropole, right? They are cautioned to present a figure, but they are incapable of attending to that direction. And so they are in medias. And so I wanted to examine what is in making in the photograph, what is being made in the photograph, what will happen when they leave the photography studio and go outside, what will happen to their familial life, but what also is happening in the political life of the place in which they are. And given that the photograph is a kind of document, a registration of their presence, in order to affect a certain kind of response when that document is received by their mother and their aunt, what is the nature of that? I wanted to undo and untangle all of that. And then when the photograph is taken, what is going on outside of the photography studio? What are the interplays, in particular in this particular neo-colonial space that these girls live in? What's going on? Well, Eric Williams has already written Capitalism and Slavery. C.R. Lloyd James has already written The Black Jacobins and Minty Alley. So much is going on outside of that, which is a counter to the movement of the photograph from that colonial local or neo-colonial local to the metropole, to Britain. So it was just fascinating to me how many things are going on at the time of the production of the photograph when you look at the photograph as a product of its time. you know,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, Sadia Hartman highlights a line that you write about this photograph, about yourself, referring to yourself as she. It goes, she does not yet understand, but maybe she glimpses the full-on violence of narrative. She is trying to find the new medium. The girl in the photograph is looking for a new medium. In that spirit, I wanted to spend the rest of our time talking about how Salvage looks for a new way to read and write, I think. You don't suggest once we abandon the canon that there is an absence of archive, but you rather point us at every turn throughout the book to books written, to alternate books to consider in the last 300 to 400 years outside of it. Books I suspect many people will be hearing about for the first time. This gesture of recovery and or repair, it reminds me of something Brandon Shimoda said in his video contribution to the celebration of A Map to the Door of No Return's 20th anniversary a couple years ago. There's this immense archive, for people who don't know, which can be found on YouTube at A Map to the Door of 20. And in his contribution, he recounts an episode in that book when you're a child, I think you're 8 years old, and you discover a book in your grandmother's bottom drawer among the sweets next to a Bible and a geometry book, a book called The Black Napoleon, about the leader of the Haitian Revolution. And you write about what encountering this meant to you. And it was a book that must have been touched with frequency and intensity. It didn't have a cover. The binding was nearly gone. You say you don't know the author. You don't know if the book actually exists, that you prefer to imagine it in this bottom drawer. Nevertheless, Brandon himself goes looking for this book, and he requests a copy, an interlibrary loan from the Wichita Library.
Yeah.
And interestingly, this copy is also barely holding together as a physical object, held together by a black bandage. It has a handwritten note inside it, dated from 1983, that it needs to be returned for mending. And Brandon adds that the return for mending seems to be never ending, as it hasn't been checked out since 1988. He writes about this at greater length in an essay of his called The Bottom Drawer or the Beginning of Reading. And I bring this up because your alternative archive feels related somehow. Your refusal of reformulation of received texts feels like it clears the table for the beginning of reading and maybe for the beginning of thinking. And I'd love to hear more about this as a practice. Maybe it is a bottom drawer practice, but tell us about more fully about having you've looked at the canonical text from Mark Twain to Jane Austen to Defoe. You've looked at various reformulations, successful and more often unsuccessful or limited. And then you arrive at a place of an otherwise and elsewhere around this.
Hmm. I love that. It's so lovely that Brandon found that the book itself and its disrepair, which seems, significant, metaphoric for the kind of unseen and not taken out since 1988. That's wonderful,
Yeah.
and lost in a way. Not lost in the bottom in my grandmother's bureau drawer, but there without a cover. And I think my uncle owned it, but I think I fantasize that that doesn't have an owner either. And that being the beginning of a certain set of recognitions, that being a kind of opening up of the world to what a book can contain, and its potency, because I think both the reader and the writer are active, engaged, not passive at all. They are both intense and intently making the world of the words and the world of the exchange of those words, and how a reading can break open a world,
Hmm.
right? And can illuminate a world. I mean that if we really truly read those books well, we will see what they have in them. We will see what they contain and what they provide, what they produce, what they illuminate, and what they suggest, and who is called to them. That is, who is who is called to enact them, to enact the roles of the protagonist, and to ignore the role of the world,
Hmm.
right? In those texts. I suppose I want to eschew the innocence of both the reader and the writer. I think that those are conceits, sometimes malevolent, of this reader and this writer who don't know the world and who don't know the world that they live in. And that somehow I try to begin from the world I know, the world I am not immune to, nor the world that I am shy of reproducing truly, right? Oh, pick me up where I've left off. Tell me, because I have a funny feeling somewhere in the middle there.
Yeah.
I'm riffing in it and going off.
Well, I mean, the other element, I think, is the way you're highlighting the bottom drawer archive as a place to reorient oneself to and then move forward from.
Yeah. Well, the thing about that archive of my early life, of my 8-year-old awakening, and that's about 4 years after that photograph,
Mm.
right? What it awakened me to was what was around anyway, namely that Black Napoleon, which seemed to me quite foundational to how I proceeded after. And as that bit in Matt points out also, that drawer contained and I'll use the word again, the voluptuousness of my grandmother's sweets and cakes and butter and whatever had to be in that drawer, right? The flour, the sugar, the rice. The flour, the sugar, the rice, the black cakes, the sweets, the candy, etc., were all stored right next to this, unusually next to this book, this Black Napoleon, this geometry book. Yeah, so like the melding of those, their appearance at the same time as part of the world, perhaps, and here I'm being fanciful, of course, right? But here is this incredible kind of bounty in this wardrobe drawer where the good things are stowed actually, because the drawer above is full of all the folded linen, the tablecloths with the embroidery, the sheets to be taken out when company comes. I mean, that wardrobe drawer is a catch of of all of that. And if I read that, it produces for me, a way to write.
I love how you're saying it reminds you of things already around you, because it reminds me of the section, your meditation in Salvage, on the way America colonizes the mind through sound. So you're looking at these British texts, but then you're looking at American music in the way it's delivering similar messages. And I think of when you're talking about Bing Crosby's Christmas songs and how they create an envy or yearning to not be where you are because the signifiers are all of somewhere else. And so everything that's happening is somewhere where you aren't. And so this idea that Black Napoleon not only is among all these other things of life, but that it itself reminds you of all the things around you,
Yes,
the things that you know, versus Bing Crosby, which dislocates you from everything you know.
right. There's a movement in that period between kind of British colonialism and American imperialism. And I speak in the text about how America arrives as sound. It arrives on the radio in Jim Reeves and you know and Bing Crosby, etc., which does another kind of interruption. That while British colonialism, those kinds of texts come as a kind of quite militaristically in a way. They are compulsory. This sound arrives as if naturally because sound is such a thing. Yeah. So this sound, its seductions are borrow from all of the qualities of sound itself, from all of the qualities of hearing, but it takes so much. Yeah? It takes away the sound of the place itself because it beckons to the sound of another place, which appears as a kind of invitation, as sound does, as music does, but which conjures yet another place of somewhere where you are not, where you do not exist, where you exist in the abject, right? So that coming of the other imperialism, because it is braced against British imperialism, but not yet so profound in the lives of those people at the time, it appears to be counter, but it actually isn't. Yeah. And it appears to be kind of beckoning to another sense of freedom. So because it undercuts British imperialism, it appears to be oppositional, right? But it actually isn't. It's merely transference of some kind. Yeah?
As we come close to an end, I want to think about what you envision beyond the wreck. If you envision something, if it's a gesture, or if it's also a gesture and a destination in your mind's eye. There was a phrase you said when you were talking with me together with Adania last month: to escape and exceed.
Mm.
And I feel like this captures so much of your work. The protagonist in your novel, At the Full and Change of the Moon, is trying to return to a maroon community, an
Mhm.
autonomous community of formerly enslaved peoples. And yet in the book, there's no return. They never find it again. And when you say in Salvage, I'm rereading these texts with the hope of abandoning them as aesthetic objects. It shares that novel's movement away from centers of violence, an escape, and an exceeding. But I wonder with that line and the line, the salvage is the life which exceeds the wreck, if there is a destination, or if the journey is in itself a destination. Before our event in New York, I asked you about how things were going, helming the new imprint at Knopf Canada, the imprint called Alchemy, because you've accepted some incredible projects for publication that are coming out next year. And you asked if I had read the Alchemy Lectures, 2 books edited and introduced by Christina Sharp. One is called 5 Manifestos for the Beautiful World, and the other, Borders, Human Itineraries, and All Our Relation. And you sent them to me, and I haven't yet had the chance to fully sit down with them. But I'm thinking of the lecture by Ronaldo Walcott called Towards Another Shape of This World, where they're returning to Naples from the Amalfi Coast, and they say, I look away from the coastline and towards the open Mediterranean Sea, where I see a tall ship with full sails on the water. A strange feeling comes over me, and I think that just beyond the ship, just where it looks like sky meets water, is where my people are. I am not one who is easily drawn into or by what others call the spiritual or the sacred, but what I felt and began to think that day was experienced bodily, and I have been troubled by it ever since. And later in the essay, he calls this an inheritance of feeling that is something more than feeling, a call to alarm to reckon with the urgency of inventing a new fable of and for life. Mm. Of course, we've spent the last 2 hours talking about the dangers of narrative, of reiterating the world, even with best intentions. And of course, many horrible things have been done in dreaming a fable into the world. But I also think of a correspondence that I've been having with an indigenous Tuvaluan therapist who lives in Australia, who is telling me that there's been research in neuroscience on the effect on the brain for both indigenous and non-indigenous people of hearing Aboriginal stories. That is, she explained to me, many people try to escape the tyranny of the executive function aspect of our brains, the getting things done, forward movement part of our lives that really interfaces well with the demands of an individualistic, capitalist, extractive culture. And they usually try to do this by mindfulness practices. But in her framing of things, these practices are ways to escape that part of the brain. But in contrast, when one hears Aboriginal stories, it actually calms this part of the brain and activates another region associated with wakeful rest. To hear stories of deep time, stories of belonging, of interconnectedness, to be in the presence of these types of stories causes these other anxious stories to recede. One doesn't have to find a way out in the presence of these stories. These stories are a way in. And I bring this up, the unrecoverable maroon community, the escape and abandonment of centers of violence, the exceeding of the narrative that we've received. And then Ronaldo's looking to a point where sky meets water and imagining a fable, one that I would imagine is more like these Aboriginal stories, Ronaldo's fable, especially because there's no land that he's picturing. He's picturing this intersection of sky and water. And I wondered if there's anything that you imagine toward when you imagine on the other side or the beyond, or if what really matters is the journey and the gesture away.
I like this idea of wakeful rest, if you will. I think you're right about the gesture, to be in the gesture. I cannot predict the ending, or what I want to do is make sure that I keep examining where I am and when I am, with consciousness. And I want my writing to reflect that all the time, to not be kind of satisfied with a given. And that is a given thing in terms of its structure, its form, or its language. I recognize the long shadow of colonialism, but I also recognize the long path of its opposite. And I recognize that it's precisely because I see that long path that I see what its opposite is. So there is a deep and long tradition of writing and thinking against these boundaries. And I want to proceed in that way because I think the tradition of coloniality is a tradition of death, and that it has kind of led to where we are on the planet right now. That's the genesis of it. And sometimes people say, but there's this other thing. The world is also, well, the world is also the other thing because of resistance to that.
Mm-hmm.
It's all the efforts to resist that, to resist those economies, to resist that system of ruling that have produced anything good in the world, quite frankly. And that's that tradition, right? So yes, maybe it is, a constant wakefulness, which is rest, because the other is to live in a kind of zombie-like tradition. Uh, yeah.
Well, let's go out with a reading of the opening, which I think evokes this gesture really well.
Okay, so I'll just read from the beginning, and the beginning section is called "To Recover Belongings from a Wreck." There is a painting by the Eritrean American artist Fikre Gebreyesus named "Solitary Boat" in red and blue. It is a painting I find utterly compelling, utterly seductive, perhaps because I love the color blue, and who doesn't? But I find the blue and this painting so luminous, so doubled. Ghebreyesus's boat drifts on an opalescent bluish-green sea along a smoke-bush green emerald sky. The boat has an ethereal appearance, its reflection drifting below in the water. Its destination is everywhere. It gestures to another reality of boats, boats that we know about, distressed in the Mediterranean or the Atlantic. I want to be in Ghebreyesus's boat, and perhaps I am. It has such light in it, and is such an invitation to uncertainty and bounty. I once wrote, even a wrecked and wretched boat still has all the possibilities of moving. But Solitary Boat in red and blue is not a wrecked boat. It is the spirit of boats that I spoke of in those lines. It is a boat moving with all haste, languor, and possibility. It is two boats, three boats, in combination with one's own elusive boat, solid, reflective, and imagined. The moths or fireflies that accompany the boat with their own gray-blue translucence almost seem to be floating on water themselves. And where is the boat going, I ask? And the answer, it seems, is to somewhere green. Its lightness and drift indicate its whereabouts and destination. I can't get enough of the painting. One's eyes are always rewarded, and that is because of its movement. If you glance away, you find it at another place, at a new place. Solitary is paradox here. There is another boat. There is another painting of a boat that I love. Remedios Varo's exploration of the sources of the Orinoco River. A woman, Varo's avatar, sits in a red, fish-like bucketed waistcoat of a boat. She arrives in this boat at the source of the Orinoco, only to find, whimsically or ironically, a coffee table with a glass spilling wine that appears to be the beginning of the river. In the painting, metaphor becomes a critique of such explorations. They resulted only in superconsumption and exploitation. Unlike Varro's painting, Ghebreyesus' solitary boat in red and blue has no destination so specific and no purpose so directive and acquisitive, nor one so ironic. There is no one on board, yet it seems everyone we wish to be or know is on board. So perhaps someone is on board. Whatever the case, this boat's intentions are not missionary, with all the attendant violent and coercive relations that go along with discovery and exploration for future uses. It does not seek information or commodifiable knowledge. It is not equipped with a compass, and the end of its journey is still open to wonder.
Thank you, Dionne. It was a special treat to get to talk to you twice this year, and also to get to meet you in person, in a shared space in the physical world. Thanks for coming back on the show.
No, thank you, David, for your deep and omnibus read.
Indeed.
The text. I really do appreciate it. I really do, I like talking to you and thinking with you, and the leaps that you two make. Thank
Yeah.
heavens. And forgive me mine. And I love the discussion we had with Ania Shibli earlier, and love
Yes, me
meeting you
too.
in person too. Yeah.
Yeah. We've been talking today to Dionne Brand, the author most recently of Salvage, Readings from the Wreck. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength makeshift home office of me, David Naiman. If you enjoyed today's conversation, consider joining the Between the Covers community as a listener supporter and help keep this quixotic endeavor going into the future. Every supporter can join our brainstorm of future guests, and every listener supporter receives the supplementary resources with each conversation, of things I discovered while preparing for the conversation, things referenced during it, and places to explore once you're done listening. Additionally, there are a variety of other potential gifts and rewards, including the bonus audio archive, which includes Dionne reading Kinesia Lubrin and Christina Sharp, Dinez Smith's reading of various poets of the Dark Noise Collective, each followed by a writing prompt by Dinez themselves, contributions by Nikki Finney, Jory Graham, and many others. There's also the Tin House Early Readership subscription, getting 12 books over the course of a year, months before they're available to the general public, rare collectibles from past guests, and a bundle of books selected and curated by me and sent to you. You can find out more at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Or if you prefer a one-time donation, you can do so by PayPal at tinhouse.com/support. I'd like to thank the Tin House team, Elizabeth DeMeo and Elisa Ogie in the book division, Beth Steidel in the art department, Becky Kramer and Isabel Lemus Christensen in publicity, and Lance Cleland, the director of the summer and winter Tin House Writers Workshops. Finally, I'd like to thank past Between the Covers guest, poet, musician, composer, performer, and much more, Alicia Jo Rabins, for making the intro and the outro for the show. You can find out more about her work, her writing, her music, her film, at aliciajo.com, ALICIAJO.com.